Hi all, welcome to the sixth lecture on Austrian School of Economics. The topic of today is the capital. And the reference book is always Principles of Economics, the Seyfdin Amos. Let's start to discuss about saving. In the last lecture we have explained the difference between consumer goods, which are owned for the utility they offer the owners, and capital goods, owned not for the utility but because they can be used to produce consumption goods that offer utility, and this should be clear from the previous lecture. What makes a good a consumption of capital goods is not inherent to the good itself, but it is a function of how the good is utilized by the person who owns it. The same good can be used as a capital or consumption good depending on the content. For example, a car can be a capital good if it is operated as a taxi, but a consumption good if it is used purely for recreational travel. The introduction of capital into economic production necessitates the lengthening of the period of production, and this is a very important topic. When capital good is involved, man needs to produce the capital good and then use it to produce the consumer good. By adding an intermediate stage of capital production, the process of production from start to finish becomes longer. Then arises the question, why spending hours on a capital goods, for example building a fishing rod, when you can just fish directly with your hands in less time? The answer lies in the productivity of the fishing rod. While producing the fishing rod takes time, once it is completed, its use should hopefully allow the fisherman to catch a larger amount of fish per unit of effort. Even though the immediate investment in manufacturing a fishing rod delays the arrival of the fish, the increase in productivity makes its long-term output more valuable than the smaller output from fishing with your hands, which arrives sooner. In fact, the sine qua non of any lengthening of the process of production adopted is saving, an excess of current production over current consumption. Saving is the first step on the way toward improvement of material well-being and toward every further progress on this way. And these were words of Ludwig von Mises. Lengthening the period of production cannot take place without initially providing the consumer goods needed to sustain the producers during the production process. In fact, providing for futures makes it possible to engage in production processes that are longer and more productive. But man can save resources to provide for the future only if he is able to meet his current needs. The farmer must produce enough grains to feed himself before he can plant any grain, and every grain he plants is a grain he cannot consume this year. If the fisherman is going to spend a day for a fisher rod, he must already have provided for this day from his previous day's production by delaying consumption that was possible in the previous day. It is impossible to engage in building a fishing rod without forsaking time away from leisure, which has a positive utility, or from labor, which produces consumer goods with positive utility. And savings is the mother of capital. Only by deferring consumption capital goods can exist. To lengthen the production process, someone must forego the consumption of resources in order to provide them to the producers. Every process that lengthens the production is only possible because of the sacrifice and delayed gratification made by capitalists. And now we can deep dive on higher productivity. Ludwig von Mises described capital good as labor, nature, and time stored up. He made a distinction between capital good and independent factors of production, nature-given material resources, and labor. This mental framework is very useful for understanding the economic function and the significance of capital. Humans are able to take nature's given resources, combine them with their labor, and over time produce capital goods and as an output. The time, labor, and resources that went into making the capital good will then result in higher productivity. Producing using capital goods can be thought of as producing with the aid of labor, nature, and time that went into making the capital good They went into making the capital good. This results in an increase in productivity, allowing the production of one unit of the final output to take less time than it would have taken without capital. Beyond just increasing productivity, capital goods allow for the production of goods that were entirely impossible without capital. This is another very important topic. In fact, as the fisherman goes from catching fish with his hands to using a fishing rod or fishing boat, not only will he will have a higher output, but he will also be able to catch species of fish that were not within his reach before he had capital. Without capital accumulation, most of the products we take for granted in the modern world would not be possible, as there is no way to produce them without bare hands. A day spent fishing with your hands will produce a few fish. With a fishing rod, you can catch around a dozen fish per day, and with a fishing boat and net, a few hundred. On the other hand, if you were one of the approximately 7 crew members of the Annelies Ilena, you will collectively produce approximately 350 tons of fish per day, or around 5 tons per worker per day. The same human being spending the same number of hours during the same day could catch 1 fish or 5 tons of fish, depending entirely on the capital he is able to deploy the task. The increase in productivity is what ultimately drives the disparity in living standards between people who can work with large amount of capital and people who cannot. And it is what makes our modern life possible. The surest and most important way of increasing human quality of life is through the accumulation of capital goods, because they serve work productivity. There is no guarantee that investing in capital will result in increasing productivity, and that is the risk inherent in the process of capital accumulation. Capital is not just the product of any investment linked in the production process. Capital consists of only the investment in the lengthening of the production process that yield higher productivity. The risk of waste is but one facet of the high cost of capital. And a good literary illustration of the value of capital comes from George Orwell's Downs and Out in Paris and London. Orwell spent a lot of time with low-income workers in both major European cities in the 20s and in the 30s. One of his most astute and profound observations about the state of poverty in which he lived, it was that how expensive everything was for poor people. Without a kitchen, every meal is expensive. Without a car, working is very time-consuming. Without a wardrobe, it is expensive to find decent clothes to look good for a decent job. Low stock of capital induces low productivity, and that, in turn, leaves very little income for saving and investing capital to raise productivity. Now we can also discuss more on the higher cost of capital. To be a capital owner, you first have to earn it. Then you have to abstain from consuming it. Then you have to deploy it in the market well enough to earn a return sufficient to maintain it. The economic cost of capital manifests in several ways. First, the drawback of capital accumulation is that it is expensive and uncertain. It requires sacrificing present consumption in order to invest resources that will only bear fruit in the future and may not bear at all. Capital requires the constant delay of gratification and deferral consumption. The opportunity cost of capital is always foregone consumption. Any person who owns any capital is at any point capable of selling the capital in exchange for present consumption goods. The moment his fishing rod is completed, the fisherman could find someone to pay a significant amount of fish in exchange for the rod. In order to continue to produce at the more productive level allowed by the fishing rod, its owner must every day reject the chance to accept a sum of fish in exchange for it. For any capital to occur, individuals must lower their time preference. They must reduce their discounting of the future enough to provide for it at an expense of the present. Second, producing capital is expensive and uncertain, and while destroying capital is very easy. Third, depreciation. It is also the nature of capital to depreciate over time it gets used. Capital is not eternal, and its employment and daily wear and tear will take their toll on it. Risk capital accumulation is also inherently risky and uncertain because on top of the risk of the destruction discussed above, there are countless reasons why capital could fail to produce the desired quantity and quality of final goods or services. Capital accumulation not only requires the sacrifice of the present for the future, but it also requires the sacrifice of the certain for the uncertain. The extent that an individual owns capital in a free market economic system is the extent to which he is able to serve people enough to maintain his capital. Fail to serve customer and your capital will depreciate until it becomes dysfunctional junk requiring disposal. So there are several risks, as we can see. The denigration and vilification of capital ownership by Keynesians and Marxists and their inability to understand the cost needed for capital accumulation has meant that governments under the influence of these ideologies have too often attempted to finance investment without pre-existing savings. Whether it is through printing physical money or credit expansion, the underlying delusion is the same. Creating claims of capital can replace the need for savings to produce capital. This dynamic and its disastrous consequences will be discussed more in the next lecture, especially in the lecture from 13 till 15. That will be also the chapter 13 to 15 of the book of Safdin Amos. Now, let's connect capital with time preference. Time preference that was discussed already in the previous lectures. What Hans Hermann Hoppe, in one of his most famous sentences, said, "Once it is low enough to allow for any savings and capital or durable consumer goods formation at all, a tendency towards a fall in the rate of time preference is set in motion, accompanied by a process of civilization." The cost of capital accumulation lies in the sacrifice of present goods that must be undertaken in order to invest resources in the production of future goods. The more that people value the present compared to the future, the higher the time preference, the less they will be inclined to defer consumption and invest in future production. As their time preference declines and their valuation of the future increases, they become more likely to forego present consumption in search of future returns. The constraint on capital accumulation is not natural or physical, it is human and lies precisely in how much of their output humans want to invest in future production versus present consumption. In other words, the constraint of capital production is time preference. As Hoppe explained, the lower the time preference, the earlier the onset of the process of capital formation, and the faster the roundabout structure of production will be lengthened. Therefore, the price of capital is a reflection of time preference. That's the connection between capital and time preference. When a man values the future output of the production process discounted for the time preference and uncertainty at a higher value than the initial investment requirement, he is likely to invest and build or acquire capital goods. Should the investment succeed, he can use more of the resources to acquire more capital goods, increasing his profit and productivity further. In turn, as the stock of capital and productivity increases over time, he becomes less uncertain about his financial future, and that lowers his time preference further, encouraging more capital accumulation. As more capital is accumulated across society and time preference declines, the price of capital determined by interest rates also declines. The process of lowering time preference and increasing investment can be understood as the process of civilization. And that is why Austrian schools is so focused on savings, because savings enable lowering the time preference, and lowering time preference set in motion the process of civilization. And now, after we discuss about savings, let's discuss about the savings fallacies from Keynesian school. In fact, there is a very little discussion of savings in modern economic textbooks, particularly with regard to the essential role of savings in generating economic production. Saving financial instruments instead of spending them is no different from saving from economic resources from present consumption in order to deploy them in economic production, or from delaying the enjoyment of leisure and engaging in labor. There is also no discussion of the inescapable need for savings to precede investment. In fact, Rather than emphasize the commonality of delaying gratification in all of these acts and their indispensable role in economic growth and progress, the typical Keynesian textbook portrays savings as an antisocial and borderline sociopathic personality trait. The starting point of Keynesian analysis is to assume that society income will be divided into spending and savings according to a predetermined mathematical formulation. Keynesian's analysis concludes that equilibrium is reached only when the quantity of savings equals the quantity of investment, even though these are two distinct concepts and accounting entries, and there is no reason for them to be equal. But according to this model, when the aggregate savings exceed the aggregate investment, that must mean that society is not consuming enough, or in other words, is saving too much. Under the Keynesian model, when people decide to stop spending a lot instead of save and hold on to cash, the economy slows, causing a widespread unemployment and bankruptcies. According to Keynesians, again, only the omnipotent and omniscient hand of coercive government intervention could rescue the market from the catastrophe that low time preference savers had inflicted upon it, providing for the future at the expense of the present. By devaluing the measure saving to finance creditors' pension and fiscal spending, the government would at once be able to increase the aggregate level of spending in society, increase the amount of investment, reduce the level of savings, and, for good measure, teach savers a lesson and set a precedent that discourages them to save in the future. The assumption is that, through central planning, all things are possible. And this we will discuss more in the next lectures. The triumph of Keynesian economics in modern universities reflects in the destruction of savings and the culture around it. The Western societies that experienced the Industrial Revolution, the benefits of modern capitalists, thanks to many decades of savings and capital accumulation, currently have savings rate in the low single digit and have been at these levels for decades. The inflationary monetary policy, which Keynesians taught as the driver of economic growth, discouraged people from savings, and when this inflation results in the inevitable crisis, the Keynesians blame the crisis on savings and suggest more inflation to remedy the effect of inflation. So, after also the savings fallacy, let's resume the main important points that for me are these 5. First is lengthening the period of production cannot take place without initially providing consumer goods needed to sustain the producers during the production process. Second, beyond just increasing productivity, capital goods allow for the production of goods that were entirely impossible without capital. Third, capital accumulation compared to present consumption is risky and uncertain. It can be destroyed easily and it depreciates. The process of lowering time preference and increasing investment can be understood as the process of civilization. These are the most important topics, and with that the lecture is finished, and see you in one of the next lectures. Bye!